kind of work that Professor Johnson is doing is very cutting edge, and we are very, very lucky to have her as a part of our intellectual community. Professor Johnson.
Thank you.
And we have a request. If you can, try to not move around too much.
Right.
Because we're also
Okay, I'll try to restrain myself.
Okay.
I know I'm going to date myself, but I came to the Harlem Project for, in fact, very personal reasons. I actually was a Columbia College undergraduate here, wow, many, many moons ago. And I think I have a very particular remembrance of New York City in the 1980s. I actually lived in, I think it's still called East Campus. We overlooked Morningside Park. And in the 1980s, Harlem was dark. Harlem was basically owned by the city and was depopulated. Central Harlem was essentially depopulated. And what population remained was, it was an interesting mix. I mean, there was still the sort of old Harlem, the sort of settled brownstone neighborhoods of near Convent Avenue, near City College, Stryber's Row, but Central Harlem, the part that Columbia basically sort of overlooks, really was just incredibly devastated. And my remembrance, and I'm not sure if I really want this recorded, but I guess it'll end up being recorded anyway, was of seeing and hearing helicopters going over Morningside Park with the lights on. If you ever have a chance to see a movie called New Jack City, I don't know if you talked about it in class or we'll talk about it.
That's one of the titles for one of our weeks.
Okay, well, it really captures in many ways what it was like to live in New York City in the 1980s, and really, in some ways, what was going on in Harlem in the 1980s, especially, I mean, the crack epidemic really just completely devastated Harlem, as in addition to other neighborhoods of color. And I just would actually add that the apartment building that they used in New York Jack City is now a luxury apartment building that I definitely couldn't afford on my salary. So, you know, it just tells you how things have changed in about 20-odd years. So, ongoing with this sort of devastation were these periodic proclamations that Harlem was back. You know, New York Magazine, which, you know, has many issues. I have many issues with New York Magazine. But one of the things they like to do is talk about real estate, and every once in a while they'd say, oh, you know, Harlem is back, everyone's buying brownstones, it's back. And it never really came back to the sense of being repopulated with diverse neighborhoods, with stronger retail, better public services. I don't think that really happened until probably the mid to late 1990s. While all this is happening, I also briefly worked for a community development corporation. And one of the things that we were doing is we were trying to build a building for seniors. Basically, the only federal money left for low-income housing essentially is senior housing. Even that might be gone by now, but that really was one of the few streams of funding left at that point for funding public housing. So we're trying to fund this building and get the funding in place and get the site in place and all these sorts of things. And again and again, it would turn out that, well, we couldn't quite get this site, or we couldn't quite get approval on the funding because of HUDC. And I was sort of puzzled, you know, why was it that here we are, we're trying to do something great for the community, but this other community group was blocking our path? Why is that? And, you know, eventually I think we sort of drew on our board of directors, and we sort of got whatever permission that we needed, informal permission that we needed from HUDC, and the building went forward. And it's occupied, and it's a great project. So I kind of put that on the back burner, and when I came back to Barnard, at least, basically HUDC was under investigation. Cuomo had left office. Governor Pataki, who was the governor before Spitzer, launched an investigation into HUDC and essentially shut it down. And I should say that his investigation was not the first investigation. HUDC had periodically been investigated by the City of New York as well as the State of New York basically from the early 1970s onwards. And that was another puzzle then. How was it that an organization that seemed to block other organizations from doing anything in the neighborhood and had also been the subject of periodic scathing investigative reports and, to my mind, really had done nothing, because essentially Harlem stood unchanged and in fact kind of got worse from the 1970s to the 1980s. How did this happen? How did this happen? Where did this organization come from? How was it able to amass so much political power and yet not use that political power for the common good? So that sort of was my personal path towards this project. And that led to a question about community development corporations in general. That is the question of what is community development? Who is it for? What community? How do you define that community? For what purpose should we engage in community development? What do you even mean by the word development? Do you mean housing development? Do you mean economic development? What kind of economic development? Do you mean retail? Do you mean manufacturing? I mean, you can sort of parse every word, and it really gets very complicated. And I think in terms of my evaluation of community development corporations, that's kind of what I conclude, is that it's not really clear what we mean. People come to it with very different approaches, very different understandings, and I think that makes the job of community development and community development corporations, what I'll call CDCs, even more difficult. Even complicating that even more is the question of Harlem itself. That is Harlem indeed still the capital of Black America? And then if we say that, or if we agree that it's the capital of Black America, well, for what blacks? Latino blacks who are of Latino descent, upper class blacks, poor blacks, middle class blacks. I mean, again, the whole question of what do we mean by community? And in Harlem, I think that really became a significant, and has been, continues to be, a significant issue. So what I want to do is kind of try to start with a kind of an overview of the sort of the background of community development corporations, CDCs, and then move into a little bit more about the history of HUDC, some of the observations that I have. One of the things that I should say, and I don't think it really has come out in the article, it's kind of awkward to say this, but people are very defensive. People who are associated with HUDC are very defensive. And I can understand why, because it had a huge mandate to develop Harlem. And they felt that they were constrained by so many things: lack of funding, lack of support, whether at the federal level, the state level, or the city level. Expectations that really exceeded the reality. So I think they're very defensive about it. At the same time, I think that all organizations, especially organizations that purport to represent communities, should be held to some level of accountability. So, you know, some of the things I'll tell you basically have been told to me off the record. People just don't really want to talk about it. And the other thing is that because I'm not quite sure where it stands now, but at the point where I interviewed people, it actually was still technically considered an ongoing investigation. So people really literally didn't want to speak on the record because they could have been subpoenaed. So that kind of gives you background of kind of the politics of HUDC, at least when I did the initial research in around 2000. Okay, so what are the goals of a CDC? Well, William Tabb, who is actually a great economist, has some really interesting work pieces, but I'll go on from that, basically gave four sort of goals for CDCs. And one was a CDC should expand economic and educational opportunities through the purchase and management of properties and businesses. Second, CDC should improve the health, safety, and living conditions through CDC-sponsored health centers, housing projects, and so on. Third, CDC should enhance personal dignity and independence through the expansion of opportunities for meaningful decision-making and self-determination. And fourth, CDC's profits should be used to pay a community, this is quote, community dividend, rather than the return to stockholders. So again, you can sort of take each goal and sort of say, well, that's a huge goal in and of itself. I mean, to create a housing project. Having worked on that, that's a multi-year project. A health center. I mean, that's, you know, taking on the U.S. healthcare system. I mean, it really is really ambitious. And so what I think I would argue is that basically CDCs were basically put in a virtually impossible position from the very beginning. That is, they were expected to deliver so much when the reality, given the structural conditions, was very limited. The second thing I really want, I hope you can take from my talk, is again the notion of participation. I talked about accountability, but there's also the element of participation. Again, who is that community, and how does that community get involved in developing or shaping that community? And what I found in my case studies is that CDC governance is not necessarily by the people, it's by the staff, by virtue of the staff orientation and commitment. So the people that I interviewed at HUDC felt that even though they may or may not have lived in Harlem, they were working for a Harlem-based organization, and so therefore they represented the needs and desires of the community. But it's one step removed. And so, again, we have to ask ourselves, well, is that really the kind of participation that we should use to evaluate and to use as a means of community development? This points to the other issue of grassroots involvement or non-involvement. I think, again, what has happened continuously and still continues to be an issue today is a feeling among many longtime Harlem residents that community development is something that happens to them. It's not something that they actually engage in. That somehow projects are announced, things happen, and then they have to sort of react. So they really, I think the feeling is that while community development organizations are supposed to allow for a more proactive stance towards the development of a community, I think most ordinary residents feel that they have no sort of say in what even community development organizations do. So I think that is an issue. And then there's the question of ultimate accountability. If we think about it in sort of a political science kind of way, for a legislator, the ultimate sanction or means of accountability is an election. But for a CDC, whose funding might come from the state, from the federal government, from foundations, from the city, it's not really clear who or what can hold that foundation accountable. And again, I think that's something that I saw not only in HUDC as sort of a worst case scenario, but even in Bed-Stuy Corporation and other organizations that I'm working on with another co-author. We're actually working on a much broader project looking at sort of first wave community development corporations over time and trying to understand what happened with these organizations from their inception in the late 1960s till today. All right. So even complicating this question of accountability and participation was its intersection at a very interesting particular moment in time of Black power. That is, with Black power came a really interesting mix of rhetoric as well as ideology. For the people who kind of came to prominence, the Black power advocates who came to prominence during the 1960s, it was not only a means of controlling land, it was actually a means of controlling the development of the community. It was a means of controlling what went on in the community. So it really was, in one sense, an oppositional force. That is, was us against them, against the downtown interests, against the sort of people who were seen as exploiting Harlem. With that came in the end, this is sort of very interesting what you sort of uncover. One of the things was, on the foundation's part, this fascination with Black power. It's interesting, it's very interesting. To foundations at that point in time, this really seemed like this source of authenticity. That is, wow, here are these people who are demanding power. This is great. One of the stories that I heard about Franklin Thomas, who was the head of Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation and then later became the longtime head of the Ford Foundation, In one of the memos, they kept talking about how tall he was and what a big afro he had. I mean, it really, and not just once, but a couple of times. Like, why are they so fascinated by his big afro? So there was sort of an interesting thing about the way the foundations themselves really saw Black Power as this sort of authentic expression of community interest and community power. Coupled with that was sort of the gender politics of Black Power itself. That is, there were many who saw Black Power as a reassertion, in a way, of Black patriarchal systems. So there was a real sense that women were playing too large of a role in developing in these community development organizations. And I just want to quote one observation. This was about Brooklyn, but I've seen other similar kinds of observations in other cities around this time. And it says this: go look at the neighborhood boards in OEO and model cities programs. They are dominated by women and preachers. You can't get the working age men to take the program seriously. The failure to involve men, the working or unemployed fathers, has been the single most important failure of the poverty program. But economic development is different. Business is man's work. It promises power and status. They come out for that. So, you know, it's kind of mind-blowing to read something like that. And I think it really, again, sort of complicates this picture of community development organizations. I think we tend to think of organizations as sort of being these kind of empty vessels, these sort of very sort of workaday kind of organizations that kind of just do things. And in fact, organizations come with a lot of baggage. They're developed, they're created within a particular political and social context. And so again, that's what I really want to emphasize about community development corporations in general, and particularly about HUDC, is that it really comes out of a particular moment in time and place. And I think for that reason alone, you know, the evaluation of how HUDC performed is can be somewhat tempered. I mean, I don't think we can be totally negative about its performance. Okay, so there are a couple sources when we think about the origins of CDCs. One was clearly from the community. I think one of the things that basically happened by the mid to late 1960s was this sort of exasperation with these studies. It was studies after, I mean, you just, you know, do any search in Clio, and I mean, the amount of studies done in the 1960s on the ghetto and the urban crisis, it's just mind-boggling, and kind of sad to think that there really is not that kind of level of attention paid to cities and urban problems now. Nonetheless, there was this real sense among residents of inner city communities that, you know, enough is enough. We've had enough studies. Please, no more. And I think these are such great quotes. During one, you know, again, endless community meeting, one of the participants said, you know, please, no more studies. We're sick and tired of studies. We just can't really have any more studies. Enough of it. So I think certainly that was one source. The second source was essentially urban unrest. The federal government politicians felt that we had to do something, or they had to do something about this urban unrest. So they they enacted the Special Impact Program, SIP, which was really a means of giving more power to local groups to engage in community development. Second source was political entrepreneurship. That is, politicians like Robert Kennedy as well as Nelson Rockefeller were looking for ways to kind of buff up their liberal credentials and advance within the Democratic Party, and then also advance to national office. Okay, so in 1964 then, Nelson Rockefeller has this vision of gaining higher office, and he basically, within the sort of very complicated space of New York state and city ethnic and racial politics, comes to a deal with Harlem's urban leaders. That is, in exchange for locating a facility in Harlem, they would give their support to his to his campaign. And so really Rockefeller is working with sort of the established Harlem political elite. And they come to agreement. They decide to put this office building, and everything seems to be great, and then suddenly black power kind of emerges in the cities. And this really, I think, shakes the older Harlem political elite, and it certainly shakes Rockefeller. It's really interesting going through his archives and seeing the memos that they're writing. They're like, what's going on? What? I thought we had a deal. Suddenly they're protesting. What are they protesting about? We're giving them a building. What else do they want? So it's really very interesting to sort of see his side. I mean, they really had no idea, why are these people protesting? They thought everyone was happy. So, and this is where you really see the direct rhetoric of black power, that they really see not just an office building, they really see it as a means of creating a community development center. That is a place for housing, a place with daycare facilities, a place for creating small businesses. So really a very different vision of Harlem than the traditional Harlem politicians were willing to accept. What is interesting, again, sort of the role of political entrepreneurship. Two politicians who were young then but are now older now, Charlie Rangel and H. Carl McCall, appear on the scene, and they're sort of the go-betweens. They kind of negotiate between these local grassroots black activists and the Rockefeller Harlem political establishment. And what they decide is in addition to the state office building, which is, by the way, a really terrible, bad piece of architecture, and I wanted to bring a picture of it to show you how bad it was, but you've seen it, so you know, was understanding that was reached with the state, and that's the HUDC. At the same time that black power and sort of this controversy over political and community control was emerging, there was another sort of surge of riots, and this was in response to Martin Luther King's death, and this was another sort of, we need to do something for the cities, and really it was seen as a tribute to Dr. King. So Rockefeller's response was the creation of an urban development corporation, something that would really work throughout the state and help to redevelop the weaker areas of the state, inner city areas of the state. An agreement that they reached with the community, and again, this is not very clear. I mean, if you can actually literally look at the memorandum of understanding, and you see the community in quotes, but it's not really clear who the community is, and they have a bunch of different signatures, but again, the question of, well, who are these people and why are they the ones to be signing this contract, essentially, with the state, setting up this new organization? And Rockefeller essentially gets his wish. He becomes the vice president, and HUDC becomes kind of a semi-autonomous part of the UDC. The UDC runs into a number of problems. Ironically, it's the source of basically the fiscal crisis, New York State and New York City's fiscal crisis of the 1970s. So it's sort of an irony that the organization that was supposed to rescue the cities ends up, in fact, making the cities worse, making the condition of the cities worse. So it essentially leads the city and the state towards bankruptcy, and all of the attention is really being paid towards bailing the UDC out of its problems, and the HUDC essentially is kind of de facto left on its own. And this is really where you kind of see the politicians take over HUDC. And this is not to say that during this time HUDC wasn't doing anything. I mean, it's in some ways heartbreaking to look at the early studies that they developed, because they really had this really interesting, really broad-based vision of redeveloping Harlem. Probably not something that we would really kind of agree with today, because it was very much an urbanist version, a modernist version of development, and not the sort of small-scale neighborhood type of development that that most architects and planners would endorse today. But they really had a really significant vision of what could be done for Harlem. As they're developing these programs, another blow comes, and this is basically Nixon gets elected, and he becomes the first of many Republican presidents who essentially say, enough with this city stuff, and begins the first of many cutbacks in urban spending. So essentially, HUDC is sort of left adrift, that there's no really oversight at the state level. There's really no oversight in terms of federal programs and federal funding, because that really kind of disappeared. And they're kind of left to kind of make their own way and figure out what are they supposed to do in this very, very difficult situation. And in fact, one of the things I talk about and what is sort of out there, and I think a number of interesting studies have been done, is the planned shrinkage of New York City. This was something, I think it was first kind of floated by Roger Starr, who died a couple years ago, which was the sense that New York City and other big cities had gotten too big. They were sort of obsolete. And so really what needed to be done was that cities needed to shrink. And the best way to shrink cities was to withdraw services. If you withdrew services, you could get people to move out of those areas, and you could kind of basically have an orderly shutdown of cities. Now, you hear this today and you're thinking, well, that's not quite right, and it's not quite right. There's actually a great book called A Plague on Your Houses. I can't remember the author, but they talk about the impact of this planned shrinkage. And one of the things that they argue is that it, in fact, helped make the AIDS epidemic even worse, because it so decimated public services that when this epidemic hit, it was able to spread. So HUDC, again, is in this very, very difficult position, because it's not even getting support from the city. In fact, the city wants areas like Harlem, Coney Island, Bed-Stuy to kind of, in essence, kind of disappear, at least consolidate. So again and again, HUDC is still producing these plans and still sort of showing them around, but there are no takers, really. And they're sort of limping along, and they come upon this idea, which is the Harlem International Trade Center. And this was really attractive from, I think, an emotional viewpoint, the sense that not only was Harlem the capital of Black America, but really, in some ways, it was the Mecca for Africans across the world, the African diaspora. And so they thought if they had this international trade center, they could attract more businesses, certainly businesses that would be interested in maintaining or strengthening a link with Harlem and with the African American community. And I think by this time there was a realization, I think, among not only people in Harlem but in other inner city areas, that any manufacturing that had existed in the cities essentially weren't coming back. And this really kind of takes out one of the sort of goals of CDCs. A lot of CDCs were created, especially in Midwest industrial areas, to bring back manufacturing. And it simply wasn't going to happen for a variety of reasons: cost, space, the nature of manufacturing itself had changed. And if they weren't going to locate in the U.S., they were going to locate in China or in Mexico or wherever costs, labor costs and other costs were lower. So what you get is a slow organizational drift on the part of HUDC. Again, I think that there was attempts to sort of turn the organization around, but really there really was no way to, there was really very little that HUDC could do during the late 1970s, 1980s. There really wasn't anything that it could do. And one of the reasons why it couldn't do anything, obviously, was money, but secondly, the city controlled the land. Most of the empty properties that were in Harlem, the brownstones especially, were owned by the City of New York, and the City of New York really had no plan, essentially, other than boarding them up and periodically putting out fires that were set by arsonists. I think I need to wrap it up soon, right?
You're doing fine.
I'm doing fine.
I'm intrigued by what happens in the crack epidemic after the depopulation of the city.
Well, what happens, and that's a good question, is that I think one of the things to Mayor Koch's credit is that he realizes that the sort of drift of the city, especially of Harlem, simply couldn't go forward. That it was in many ways this huge untapped potential. Secondly, because of the crack epidemic, because of the gentrification in other areas, people who had lived, say, in SROs in Midtown, even the Upper West Side, were essentially being pushed out. So there's a huge homeless issue. And suddenly, oh my gosh, we've got to house these people. So where's housing? Where's their housing? Well, it turns out Harlem. So the first really grand city plan that really emerges as a result of this realization that, we need to put these people somewhere. And in fact, there were attempts to send them to other cities, like to Newark, New Jersey. And Newark said, well, we have our own problems. Why are you sending us more poor people? So I think it was this realization among the Koch administration that something needed to be done. And I think, there were people within the Koch administration who said, this is something that, we could obviously make money on. So, I think certainly the real estate industry, the people who tend to be long-term players really knew and understood that, New York City possibly was coming back. And if New York City was going to come back, the next big frontier in terms of access to downtown would be Harlem because of its subway connections and because of its housing stock. Outside of some areas of Brooklyn, really Harlem was the last area that had this sort of density of brownstones, of really nice, potentially nice brownstones, as well as vacant land. So HUDC, though, one of the things that happens with HUDC, and I think one of the things that we have to be aware of in terms of these organizations, is the question of leadership. There's the question of accountability, but then also the question of, well, if there's no accountability, then there's no way to sort of evaluate leadership. And sometimes, quite frankly, organizations need new leaders. And in the business world, well, what happens? Your stock price goes down, the CEO or the president gets forced out. In an educational institution like Columbia, the president stops bringing in grant money, or he stops bringing in donations, and so we need a new president. It wasn't really clear how you could get new leadership or new blood into HUDC. So it had a long-time director. In fact, basically, it had essentially one director. The early director had been pushed out. And the board was a sort of a kind of a weird board. It had a mix of permanent members, and then it had politicians. So the politicians would usually designate someone in their office to stand in their stead. So there really wasn't a kind of continuity of control over in terms of the board of directors. And so there really wasn't a way to kind of say, okay, times are changing, HUDC. You need to be a little bit more nimble. You need to sort of realize that, people are getting interested in Harlem. You need to maybe stop thinking about, the Harlem International Trade Center, or stop thinking about Harlem on the Hudson, which was this vast kind of casino development hotel complex. It really was a very interesting one, but not quite realistic, and really sort of focus on, developing brownstones or putting together mortgage pools or something like that, which is something that Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation had actually been fairly successful in doing. So basically, I think HUDC is sort of kind of plugging along, and by this time other people and other voices are emerging in Harlem. So in some ways it's sort of the breakup of the sort of traditional Harlem elite. That is, there are other people who have come to sort of prominence through other means, certainly through the sort of social policy world, the foundation world, and they have their own organizations backing them. So there really is sort of more energy. Ford Foundation has developed a couple of different organizations that really were involved and started to become more involved in community development during the late 1980s and 1990s. And HUDC, I think for a variety of reasons, didn't quite realize that it was shifting, that the terrain was shifting. And I think what was also shifting in terms of what was happening in Harlem was that it was, I think the shifting had turned away from the notion that you would have one large monolithic organization sort of controlling development in one place towards a vision that was in some ways more pluralistic. That is, you'd have lots of different organizations competing for funding, which can be good and bad, but it would lead to more flexibility, more responsiveness. So I think that was part of what was happening in the foundation world as well as the policy world during especially during the 1990s, the sense that large organizations aren't necessarily the best kinds of organizations for redeveloping areas, inner city areas. So given that, what happens then is that HUDC is kind of existing in its own world. And I think periodically there are attempts to kind of talk to the leadership and try to get them to do other things. But for a variety of reasons, Cogsville, I think the leader of the executive director, is really kind of resistant. And HUDC becomes really firmly aligned with, in the minds of many people, with Rangel and with the sort of Black Democratic caucus. And so when Governor Pataki, a Republican, is elected, he really goes after all of his enemies, but goes after HUDC in particular. And I think, it wasn't just Pataki. I think a lot of the sort of journalists who covered New York City politics had really heard a lot about HUDC and its sort of lack of ability to get things done. And in fact, it's kind of obstructionist tactics, trying to block the activities and the development of the development work of other organizations. So he goes after HUDC, and he essentially is able to shut it down. And it's unfortunate that it happened the way that it did, because one of the things that HUDC did was they essentially got rid of a lot of their records. So the history of HUDC, unfortunately, is very fragmented. Because I think it just kind of, people said, well, it's done, we're over, we're done, and they kind of walked away. So unfortunately, it wasn't quite an orderly shutdown. I think people just sort of felt like, they were under attack, and that was it. So what does this all mean? I think that what it means in terms of thinking about development in Harlem is that it's very much, and has always been, a contested question about who exactly should be controlling Harlem. One of the things that happens when HUD is shut down is another organization is created, and this one really has kind of the combined backing of the foundation world, city and state government. They put in Deborah Wright, who was also had been head of the empowerment zone, if I believe correctly.
And a Republican.
And a Republican. There you go. And she really has this extraordinary support. And I've been sort of thinking about this lecture. I've been trying to tease out was it her? Was it the Times? It could have been anyone, that it was just sort of the right time for Harlem to develop the way that it did, or was it simply that people were just resistant to the notion of a community development organization that was explicitly designed to be under the control of the community? And it's hard to tell. I think it's partially both. I think that there was a real resistance on the part of those outside of Harlem to really kind of be comfortable working with an organization that really had such a strong stance in terms of community control. I think that the organization itself didn't help itself by its sort of lack of focus and its sort of lethargy. It got older and got sort of lethargic. So I think that HUDC was put in a very, very difficult position, and I think that one of the sort of questions to ask, if in fact they had been given the type of support that the new organizations have been given, would they have developed Harlem in the same way? And I have to say that I'm not really sure. I think there's been a lot of criticisms of Harlem's current development, that it really has relied more on national chains, that there really hasn't been a lot of attention to the development of local businesses who, would contribute to the capital base of Harlem. And, given not only what's facing not only Harlem but other inner city areas, I'm not really sure if that kind of vision of economic development that rests on small local businesses really is possibly a viable one for the 21st century. I think it's a nice idea, but I'm not really sure if it really ultimately could have been done. So I think that, when I look at community development corporations, when I look at Harlem, I see lots of competing interests and competing values. I think there's the notion that that the organizations should serve the people who have lived there the longest. I mean, there are people who have lived through a lot in Harlem. They've lived through, the fires and the arson and the crack epidemic, and they really have stayed when others have left. And now some of them have stayed because they really had no other place to go, but others have stayed because they really believed that Harlem was a special place and ought to be preserved and protected. So for them, the question of who Harlem is for and what Harlem should be. Should it be simply another version of 14th Street? Should it just be another sort of strip of national chain stores? Or should it be sort of a small community or an organic community where people know each other and you know your neighbors? Or should it be just simply a transient area where people kind of come and go and it's sort of anonymous, large apartment buildings? And I think in some ways Harlem was very lucky. There are other organizations that we've looked at in St. Louis, in Newark, New Jersey, which is, haven't had this kind of development, however it has turned out, that Harlem has experienced. So I don't want to run it down, but again, if you have a vision of urban life as being something more than chain stores, I'm not really sure that the Harlem development has really approached that. On the other hand, certainly it's much better than it was in the 1980s. I think for the people who continue to live there and the people who have now lived there, it's a great, vibrant community. It's got lots of things going on, and I think there really is a sense that it's arrived. So after all these sort of perhaps possibly proclamations that Harlem has arrived, I think truly it has arrived. The question is the role of community developments now and in the future in terms of shaping Harlem's development. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for some questions.
Yes.
Professor Johnson, you mentioned in the beginning of your talk that New York Magazine article,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I might have read the same article, but that article mentions the three-headed monster of Harlem. It talks about Mr. Rangel, former Mayor Dinkins, and
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Percy Sutton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I didn't mention the Suttons. Okay. Yeah.
It sort of implied that the three-headed monster was sort of an obstructionist force
Mm-hmm.
in terms of community development in that particular period. But in your article, you also mentioned that for others, especially an ambitious politician named Charles Rangel, it could be an opportunity to fuel future political ambitions. Does your article sort of mirror what was suggested in the New York Magazine piece?
Well, I think there are two things. One of the things is that, first of all, I shouldn't say call him Charlie, Representative Rangel has a very interesting political career because he actually defeats Adam Clayton Powell, who in some ways, it's kind of interesting how kind of careers kind of parallel each other. So he actually defeats Powell and is seen as this sort of big, fresh breath of fresh air. Powell is seen as this kind of out of control guy, and Powell, and Rangel comes in and kind of says, okay, I'm going to, represent Harlem. I'm going to really advocate. I'm not going to go on my cruise boat and, hang out with pretty women like, Adam Clayton Powell. So, but given that, so that's Rangel. I mean, Rangel, I think, sees this as an opportunity to sort of make his mark and kind of differentiate himself from, the Harlem kind of, I mean, now they're all, I think, very close, but I think at that point in time, he was seen as this sort of newcomer and they weren't quite sure about him. I think the other thing about that New York, I mean, there's been a couple of New York articles. New York Magazine has essentially been, in my opinion, has always been fairly hostile to David Dinkins. If this is a great research project, that really go back and look at the media coverage of Dinkins, and from day one, completely negative. I mean, just they had nothing good to say about David Dinkins. So I think in many ways, this was kind of, that article was a reflection of this kind of, these guys who we don't really like because they really don't see themselves as having to sort of kowtow to City Hall. That they see themselves as really kind of separate from and not beholden to the sort of city establishment. So I think that's part of what's happening in that article. That said, I mean, I think Percy, Sutton, and Rangel and Dinkins have been, and probably still are, very politically powerful. And I think they really shaped a lot of what kind of went on in Harlem, especially during the 70s and 80s. Does that answer your question?
Well, if I could just perhaps be more pointed.
Okay.
Do you consider them as having been obstructionists in terms of community development?
Do I consider them being obstructionist? I think that I'm being filmed, so No, I mean, I think that certainly they have their own business interests, but I think they simply weren't willing to. I mean, I think it's an issue of turf, that they saw Harlem as their turf. And why should they sort of say, okay, you want to do this? Sure, fine, whatever. So, yeah, that could be construed as obstructionist. And certainly from the point of view of the small development organization that I worked for, certainly having to get their approval, that was definitely not great. But on the other hand, I think they did see themselves as kind of, this is our turf, just as the other politicians in other areas of the city would say possibly the same thing. So. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I just need one more, sorry.
Sure.
Given the final disposition of the HUDC, are you familiar with the HDFC as opposed to HUDC, Housing Development Fund Corporation?
Yeah.
It's another.
Yeah.
Given the unfortunate disposition of HUDC, how do you explain the current situation in HDFCs where it's the same low accountability, malfeasance, and what is done in light of the gentrification and changes in Harlem? It's created thousands and thousands of sort of vulnerable co-op owners because we've had the same situation repeat itself. My question specifically is that how do you explain, because I've read your article trying to find an answer, and I just cannot understand why there's on the city, state, or federal level almost no accountability.
Well, I think that's it's an interesting question. In fact, that's kind of a separate article, and it's a separate issue, which I think people haven't really thought about, is that basically when federal funding essentially is shut off, the state at some point steps in, starts offering money, but really there's not a lot of money. And so what happens in the late 1980s, 1990s is this notion of leveraging. Let's leverage money. So you have organizations like the New York City Partnership. You have an organization called LISC, Low Income Support Corporation. I think that's what it is. I could be wrong. And there's actually there's a provision in the tax code where you can actually sell some sort of a bond in order to raise money for housing. And so what happens is that creating housing becomes, basically financing housing becomes incredibly complex. I cannot tell you how complex it is. Basically, you might have 4 or 5 or 6 different kinds of funding stream coming in just to create a 10-unit building. I mean, if you want to talk about inefficiencies, I mean, that's inefficient to have 10 different or 5 different funding streams come in for a 10 or 20-unit building. The amount of paperwork that you have to do, the amount of due diligence you have to do, it's it's not efficient. I don't think it's quite rational. But that it was, and I think still is the reality, is that, foundations went through this phase where they really wanted, organizations to show that they were entrepreneurial and nimble and they could go out and raise money. So what you have then is that this scramble to bring together money, and then you also have a scramble to produce housing, because, it's bad now. But, you had a serious homeless problem starting in the 1980s with gentrification and, the continuing, basically, decay of housing, decay and abandonment of housing. And so all these groups are scrambling to provide housing, and HFDCs, in some ways, are kind of, little kind of almost like holding companies, if you will, to sort of put together the financing packages for housing. And sometimes they were used for buildings that were renovated and then people would be put in, or these were actually buildings where people lived in, and then they sort of used this HFDC structure as a means of financing the rehabilitation of the building. But I think in some ways it was very short-sighted, that it was, this is the best way to sort of get the funding together and to get the housing developed. And I think also, not only for all sorts of things in the community development world, is that I think people think, this is housing, this is a great thing, and everyone's going to act nicely. And so I think they're built with the best of intentions. They assume that people will run them with the best of intentions. But unfortunately, the world isn't like that. People don't necessarily act with the best of intentions. And I think this is one of the tensions of these. Is one of the organizations that I looked at is another organization called Banana Kelly in the Bronx. And one of the things that they quickly came to the realization was that at the end of the day, essentially, they're landlords. And if someone doesn't pay their rent, they've got to kick them out, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of developing low-income housing so people who don't have homes have a place to live. So, CDCs they're really just caught in this incredibly awkward position where they're supposed to be, saviors of the neighborhood, but on the other hand, houses and buildings don't heat themselves. You're not doing a favor to the other people in the building by letting people not pay the rent, because you're not going to have enough money to pay for the housing, to pay for the heating bill. And then the city comes in and says, well, got to vacate the house, got to vacate the building. It's not up to code. And then you're right back where you started. Yes?
All right. This is absolutely fascinating, and I would love to keep you here for 3 hours, but we can't do it because we have these other presentations. Yeah. But since I'm the professor in the class, I'll privilege myself and ask the last two questions.
Okay.
The first is about your interpretation of neoliberalism and what happened in the 90s to the early 21st century. Just a comment. My sense is the shift in Pataki is not so much a shift to a Republican regime, because Rockefeller was a Republican. Okay. And in this state, in this city, you've had historically this weird relationship where Republicans were actually, throughout most of the 20th century, the liberal party. And the Democrats, because of Tammany, were the conservative party. That isn't true in the United States, but it was true in New York.
Right.
And the most liberal mayors New York has had have been Republicans, basically, if one thinks about it.
Right.
LaGuardia, Lindsay,
right.
They're Republicans.
Right.
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 What happened in the 90s was a shift from Keynesian urban management to neoliberalism and privatization.
Right.
And that Debbie Wright represented a black face on that process. And the reason that she's been so successful, the argument that many people make who are critical of privatization is that there is a shift from allocating resources through the state to enhance civic outcomes to having basically a private model. And that's how come you get the chain stores. And that's how come you have essentially a real estate-driven model, because what it's about is privatization. And so that the development of Harlem using a neoliberal model means that poor people will lose out in the process. And things get more expensive. And Cinderella is a great place to shop, but not too many poor people can afford to buy their meat there.
Right.
Okay.
Or we want
Get
some of
their
those
ice cream
meats,
from
right?
Ben and Jerry's.
Right.
All right, so just what is your take on that? Neoliberal, that's the first thing.
Okay.
And the second thing is Columbia's version of development is Manhattanville, and the expansion of the university from 125th Street to 133rd Street. What's your take on that? Does that benefit the development of West Harlem?
Okay. First one, neoliberalism. Whew, in 3 words or less. Well, I think that you're right. I mean, I think that what happened is essentially a notion that I think there really was, it's a trickle-down effect of the government is bad. And nothing that government does can in any way be good. So not only is funding cut off, but this notion that, anything that government does really is dysfunctional. I mean, at the same time that you're seeing this cut in funding, you're seeing, and I think somewhat warranted critiques of, say, public housing. Public housing, at least the way that some of these projects were built, were completely dysfunctional. And so I think what happens is that it's this delegitimization of any kind of public role, that it's just going to be bad. You're just going to see bad outcomes. I think the other thing is, a kind of a privatization of social space, of public space. I mean, at the same time, you're having government say that we are not obligated to provide housing for people unless it's under court order. You also have the development of business improvement districts, who hire their own security guards, who hire their own sanitation crews. You have also the development of gated communities. I mean, essentially, this is not just New York City, it's happening across the nation, where there's really this notion that there is a constraining shared public space, and whether or not there ought to be, I think there is, and that government really shouldn't play a role in supporting whatever public space there is. And that if you can't afford your own private space, well, that's too bad. It's the efficiency of the market. So it is this kind of, markets are great, markets are fabulous, but people make markets. And I think that's what advocates of free markets don't realize, that people make markets. They don't just sort of magically arise. So that's my neoliberalism answer. My second Columbia answer, I should preface it saying that I don't have tenure. So
Well, be diplomatic.
I'll be diplomatic. I just want to be very clear. I don't have tenure, right? I think part of me feels like, certainly they've learned from the past in many ways, that it's not a replay of 1968. I mean, they certainly went into it very gingerly, although, secretly, because they're an investor, just like any other investor. And any other investor, Trump or whoever, would have done the same thing, that very quietly acquired properties or rights to property. And that's kind of what you do. If they, in fact, had said, oh, we're going to expand, it wouldn't have gone beyond that, we're going to expand. The second issue is whether or not it's a good thing. Well, or is it a good thing for West Harlem? I think given what's happening with the rest of Harlem, my sense of it is that I always sort of wondered why those didn't become lofts, essentially. Why didn't Manhattanville essentially become another Soho? It's got a great space. It has kind of the cobbled streets. It's next to 125th Street. It's on the water. And well, now I know it never became a Soho because, in fact, Columbia was buying it up. So I think if Columbia wasn't doing it, the private market would have done it. I don't think, given the state of development, of community-supported development, that, whatever happened there would have been fragmented, that, community organizations may have been able to get 1 or 2 buildings here or there, but in terms of controlling development in that area, it hasn't shown up in other areas of Harlem. That it's really been very much a market-driven development. So, unfortunately, I think that's what's happening in Harlem in general. So, whether it was Columbia or Trump or LaFrac or whoever, I mean, someone was going to come in and get that, given the absence of a will and political power on the part of people of Harlem to control their own destiny.
Okay, very good. All right.
Okay.
You have been really great, and I have to cut it because we have presentations.
All right, I understand.
Let's thank Professor Johnson.
Thank you.